Good morning and welcome to our weekly livestock market update. This is a special edition. Today we're broadcasting from the Heart of America Dairy Expo in Springfield, Missouri. With me, as always, is University of Missouri's Scott Brown. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Megan. It's good to be side by side this morning.
It is nice to be able to sit next to you and do this. So we're going to, as we kind of outlined a little bit, we're going to talk a little bit about dairy prices and some of the dairy market issues today. We're going to talk farm policy, and we're also going to talk about the livestock markets in general. So let's get things going. And let's start first and talk a little bit about the U.S. milk supply. What do we need to focus and what are some of the big things there?
Well, number one, we continue to see expansion occurring in U.S. milk supplies in the country. When you look at the last milk production report that we have from USDA, up about 2.3% relative to a year ago in U.S. milk supplies. That has been a number of states that have increased. We can talk about Texas, Wisconsin, California, who's been down for much of the last several months, who actually showed slightly above for the month of November. So milk supply growth as we look ahead into 2017 is important because I think we're going to continue to see about another 3% increase in U.S. milk supplies, which means we need stronger demand as we look ahead. We'll get our very first glimpse of another milk production report next Tuesday that's going to be important to set the stage. I think this battle of additional milk supplies occurring in this country is going to be one of the things that could put pressure on what's otherwise looks to be a higher milk price scenario for this year.
Let's talk a little bit about that. As we look at all of the other commodities, livestock and row crop commodities are all down. Are we surprised to see the strength in the dairy market right now?
I think when you look across all the commodities, absolutely. It's one of the few that I think we still expect we're going to see higher prices in 2017 relative to 2016. Now, I like to remind us that 2016 was not a very good year for us in the dairy industry. A lot of folks struggled financially given where prices were, especially in the mid part of 2016. And so we're coming up from low prices. I don't suggest 2017 is going to be a stellar year, but I think much of what we see happening is that supplies in many other countries around the world have been contracting of late, and that's giving us some opportunity for higher prices.
When we talk about higher prices, Scott, you don't typically talk about a market being able to support higher prices when we're looking at big numbers. What is giving us that price support?
Yeah, so I think when you look at the push and pull that we have going on in the milk market today, especially for U.S. milk market, it's yes, we have growing milk supplies that are the negative in terms of pulling down milk prices, but the rest of the world demand seems to be stronger. We can talk about a number of markets there. Mexico is certainly one where one of our largest by volume traders in terms of taking U.S. dairy products. China continues to be an important market globally. But I also think when you look at what's been happening in Australia, New Zealand, the EU, where we've seen contraction in milk supplies, the combination of contraction by those other countries plus stronger demand in the rest of the world is the reason why we can talk about higher prices in this country in 2017.
We talked a little bit yesterday. We were talking about increases in cheese demand, increases in butter demand. Is that a lot related to the consumer side of things?
Absolutely. I think it's a very good situation that we see unfolding when you look at the demand picture in the United States for dairy products. The idea that we're using a lot more butter in a number of products around the country is important to where we've seen prices. The fact that we continue to see increases in per capita cheese consumption in this country, providing ways to use more U.S. milk is critically important. Although we don't like the total fluid milk demand situation, I'll say the fact that we see increases in whole milk fluid consumption is starting to show me that consumers are looking for more dairy fat in the diet, not less, and all good news for us.
So the fact that fat is becoming good again when it comes to a healthy diet is helping us on the back end?
Absolutely. I always say if you want to help your industry the most, it's putting products in front of consumers that they really desire and are willing to pay a premium for, and I think we're starting to see that in the dairy industry.
Let's talk talk a little bit about the price side of things. Volatility really has been kind of the name of the game the last couple of years. Do we anticipate that continuing in 2017?
So I think that's a tough question. I'll often say that I'm a great milk price forecaster. Somewhere between $14 and $22 a hundred, I think will get us for 2017. So, and I say that jokingly. It's been a lot of volatility the last 5 years. We've had a lot of large things happen that I think have driven that volatility. However, when I look at the markets today, I say, number one, we got increased supplies. I think that keeps some of the price increase in check that we might see. We don't have a drought occurring in major areas right now. The southeast is showing some dry, but if we had a major drought next year, that could have volatility. So I always will say risk management's important in these markets right now, but we might be back to what's a little less volatility looking forward. Do not look in the rearview mirror and look at that volatility and say it's going to repeat exactly like that as we go forward. It can repeat like that, but the probability is probably not all that high. Unfortunately, that leaves us with what's a lower price outlook with maybe a little less volatility, so not very many opportunities to take advantage of maybe higher prices during those volatile periods.
Let's talk a little bit about risk management in general. As we look at that, how does it differ on the dairy and the livestock side opposed to maybe how we look at risk management on row crop side of things?
So I think when I see crop producers around this country, they're much more comfortable with using many of the tools that we have available today, whether it's futures markets, forward contracting, a number of options to try to price those grain commodities going forward. We have some of the same tools available to us in livestock and dairy markets as well, yet we're not nearly as comfortable as using them, or we don't seem to use them nearly as much. I often will say, I think one of the problems we have in using some of these risk management tools is that many of us have the objective of maximizing revenue using these risk management products. I will often say sometimes you want to pay that premium for a futures contract and not actually collect on it. That meant prices went higher than where you thought they were. Yet the mentality of I paid X dollars for that contract and it never came back to provide anything back to me, I'm never doing that again, you cost me money. So I think the idea that we use risk management not to lock in the absolute market high, but to try to reduce the risk of prices moving lower. And that's important as we try to use risk management tools in these industries.
Does that also mean paying attention to obviously prices received, but prices that we pay for goods as well as on the input side of things?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've all learned over the last few years that margin management is very important. So not only is it what's my output price looking like, but what does it cost me? In the case of livestock commodities, it's what's the feed side cost. And many times I may be wanting to be in a situation where I lock in both sides of that at once. Locking in only one side, revenue or cost, might not be the best strategy given some of the volatility that we've seen of late.
Once again, I'm Meghan Grebner, Brownfield News Anchor reporter, and I'm with University of Missouri Scott Brown, and we're taping a special edition of our weekly livestock market update here. Let's get into one of those big topics, Scott. MPP, the Margin Protection Program. One of the things we do know about it, it's not working. Let's start first and talk a little bit about why.
Yeah, so I think when you look back at the 2014 Farm Bill and the development that we saw for the Margin Protection Program, I often like to remind us that we took a big swing in dairy policy in 2014 relative to previous policies that we would have had via Price Support Program and the MILC program. I think when MPP was passed in 2014, for those that remember, feed costs at the time, and I'll say corn prices, for example, were north of $5. And the fact that corn prices have come down substantially since the passage of MPP made it not pay very well in 2016. And oftentimes I like to remind us that the cost side of that MPP is based on prices received for different feedstuffs by producers in this country. Many of us know that the cost of producing an acre of corn or an acre of soybeans was much higher than what the prices we were receiving for those products as well. And so I think the cost side is what really caught us in 2016, where we did not get MPP payments maybe to the level that we would have thought we would have when we passed the 2014 Farm Bill.
So you said we took a big swing and we missed. Do we abandon it, or do we try to restructure it and find a program that works best for producers?
Yes, I think we're going to get a chance to debate this over the next several months as Congress thinks about a 2018 Farm Bill. I tend to hear right now, it seems to me, a lot of folks are focused on how do we modify this margin approach that we started down to make it better for folks. I see early out of the gate much more focus on the feed cost side and whether or not we need to make some adjustments there to the formula to make it perhaps pay more often. I always like to remind us that anything we do relative to policy of any sort, that if we want it to be more effective, we're probably going to have to spend more money. And that's where we're going to have, I think, our challenge for trying to get a new program when we see a federal budget situation that's very tight.
While we're on the topic of Farm Bill programs, let's talk a little bit about some of those other ones. We finally, as of yesterday, have a nominee for the Secretary of Agriculture. There's a glaring similarity between a lot of the heads on the ag side of things, and it's primarily South. What does that mean for some of those other programs? We think about ARC PLC. What about cotton? What about peanuts? How will all of those come into play in a scenario where budgets are already tight?
Yeah, so I think it's very interesting when you look at the makeup of where we are today. We maybe have a little more southern flair when you look at House and Senate Ag Committees, as well as our new Secretary of Agriculture coming from Georgia. I think there'll certainly be the interest in what's best for them.
As we look at the big picture of those programs too, we talked just briefly about ARC and PLC. That's going to see a significant change in 2017, and for those payments then again potentially in 2018.
Yeah, when you look at what's been for traditional Midwest commodities, a lot of folks signed up for the ARC portion of that ARC PLC choice, and we've seen for many counties in this country, large ARC payments occurring for corn in particular as revenues have been working down. But you have to remember those ARC programs work off of a moving average of revenue, and as we continue to get away from what were very high revenue periods in years like 2012 and 2013, the chances of getting an ARC payment continue to slide lower. So fewer ARC payments probably are the case as we move ahead. And again, whether that's what folks in crop country want, we'll have to wait and see as we look ahead.
We talked a lot about those budgets being tight. Do we run a great risk in the agriculture industry if we start pitting commodities against each other, or we maybe look into the SNAP side of things to try and pull money to make sure that there's fixes to these programs?
Yeah, I think first of all you have to understand that the chances of getting more money for the next Farm Bill relative to what we're spending today is probably not very high given federal deficits that we're running today. And so when I look at what's been happening, so the cotton folks want to fix, the dairy folks want to fix, we might want something different rather than ARC and PLC. All those things cost money. All right, we might want to spend, some would want to spend more on SNAP programs as we look ahead. So now all of a sudden, if the pie doesn't get any bigger, yet you have all of these different pieces wanting more, how do they get it? And that may be where we start to see the fight among commodity groups that we haven't seen for a while. And that will be a dangerous road for us to travel because it pits us against each other in ways that we just haven't seen for a long time.
Let's talk a little bit about the trade side of things. As we get into that, exports have been huge in price supports for soybeans and for the livestock market side of things as well. How much of a role and how big of a role does that continue to play as we look ahead in the coming years?
Yeah, when you look at demand for U.S. agricultural products in the next decade, much of the growth that we're going to see does not come within the United States. Now, I want to make sure that I remind us that U.S. consumption or demand, however you want to define it, still may be a large proportion of what we do, but the growth in front of us is going to come from outside the United States. When you look at income growth projections, We have much stronger income growth projections tending to occur in a number of Asian economies relative to our own. We have a much larger population base sitting outside the United States that's looking for more food as we look ahead. So we have to continue to do things to make sure that those markets are open to our U.S. Products. So trade's going to be very important, you know, and so I've already talked about Asia. I often tell my students on campus, I say, if anybody's ever talking to you about, you know, what's important as you look ahead, I said 2/3 of the time you'll be right if you answer China. All right, Chinese will be very important, but don't forget, one of our top markets lays to the south. Mexico being top for dairy products in particular. We have to continue to make sure that we look at all markets, because growth in consumption of U.S. milk products is going to come outside the United States.
A reminder too, if you have questions for Scott, feel free to write them down and hold them up in the air and we'll grab them. So if you have a question that you'd like addressed, this is an interactive opportunity for you as well. So we talk about trade. Today's a big day, inauguration of a new administration, and it's a pretty contentious trade environment, Scott. So as we look at the threat of, once the inauguration is complete, that first 100 days, pulling out of TPP, getting back into NAFTA, what does that mean?
I thought you were going to tell me it was a big day because you and I were together.
Well, there's that, but there's also that other big thing going on.
Exactly. That's so maybe we need to go upstairs into the TV and watch as well. But no. So number one, I think it's going to be a very interesting time. I like to remind us that, all right, so our last cabinet pick going in was Secretary of Ag. Yet we have a lot of work left to do to get all of the political appointments done below the cabinet level. And so we're going to talk about, and I'll say it, months to kind of see much of administration take shape to know what's going to happen on a regular basis under a Trump administration. So I don't expect we're going to wake up tomorrow and this is all going to become crystal clear. Again, it will take time for all those appointments to happen. But trade is very important. We've talked about renegotiating TPP. I like to remind us that as a country, that there are issues we need to be worried about. Jobs, number one. I think President Trump has figured that out. But from an ag perspective, I think it's very hard to say TPP for agriculture is not a win in many cases. I often like to remind us, let's just stick to the facts here for a second. Beef going into Japan from Australia faces a tariff today of about 26%. Beef from the United States going into Japan today faces a tariff between 35 and 40%. A successful TPP would have moved our tariff going to Japan to less than 10. Australia already has a deal cut with Japan that moves theirs to less than 10 very quickly. So those tariff cuts are very important in terms of what we do in agriculture. Now, from a dairy perspective, I still think it's a win for U.S. dairy, despite some countries will have additional access. Renegotiating NAFTA, you have to remind us that Mexico is a very important market for us for a number of ag commodities: cattle, dairy, pork, all very important. So we're going to have to tread carefully in terms of we need those markets to continue as we look ahead.
We're taping a special edition of our weekly livestock market update today. Scott and I are broadcasting from the Heart of America Dairy Expo. Scott, let's get into some of the things that we typically talk about, and then we'll take a question. We'll wrap up with a question from our audience. As we look at livestock markets in whole, how did things fare this week?
Yeah, so I think when you look at cattle markets, number one, we've seen cash cattle prices continuing to move higher as we've looked through the week. So it's been another good week despite what's been increases in supplies of cattle. Hog prices, cash hog prices have been up for the week. When you look at futures markets, we've been up $2 to $3 for the week for cattle, and we've been relatively flat for hogs. So it's been a fairly good week from a price standpoint. When you look at where we're at in terms of wholesale values, both the beef choice beef cutout value and the pork cutout value have been reasonably flat for the week. It tells me that we're seeing some margins that are a little tighter than for packers than we've seen for a while. So all good news for us as we look at where hog and cattle prices have gone for the early part of this year.
As we look ahead to next week and as we round out the month of January, can you believe we're almost really our first month of 2017 is wrapping up? Cattle on feed is next week, and following that, cattle inventory. What are some of the things we're watching in that first report? And then we'll get to the cattle inventory.
Yeah, so cattle on feed, number one, what are we doing short term in terms of supplies of cattle in the feed yard? We have seen placements that have been running well above year-ago levels as we've increased the cow herd and cattle inventories in this country. I think when we look at next week's report, we're going to continue to try to get a sense of what's happening to placements. How many calves have we kept on winter wheat that might start coming to the feed yard? And I think it gives us a better indication of how much supplies of cattle and beef will ultimately be hitting as we get into the summer and fall of this year. So it really sets the stage for the short run when we look at that cattle on feed report. When we look at the cattle inventory report we're going to get the following week, for me that's a very critical one. We have not seen a count of cow numbers or total cattle inventory for the last year. We normally get that every 6 months, but because of budget cuts, USDA did not give us a July cattle inventory report. And so I think there's going to be a lot of interest in how big is the beef cow herd come January 1 of 2017. I'm a little worried that we're getting increased supplies of cows despite what was a pretty tough economic situation as we continue through 2016. And I worry about whether we get some market moves as a result if we end up with a report that gives us still a substantial expansion in beef cow numbers.
One of the things we've been talking about recently is egg prices, poultry prices in the poultry market. South Korea recently agreed after their avian influenza outbreak to import eggs from the United States in large numbers for the first time in several years. How are the egg markets faring?
Yeah, so I think when you look at U.S. egg markets, it's been very interesting. So last week, if you would have watched those markets, I think we saw a little bit of strength in response to what was hopeful of moving more eggs to Korea, because we have a situation where we have too much eggs in the country after coming through our own AI situation back in 2015. But I think as we've looked this week, those same markets have searched for how much positive to give to the number of eggs that we're shipping to Korea. I think it still is a small percentage relative to overall domestic supplies of eggs. So I don't think we've gotten a huge lift in egg prices as a result, but it's nice to be able to talk about a little firmer egg prices relative to what's been a free fall for a period of time.
All right, are you ready to really get on the hot seat?
Absolutely.
Audience question time. We'll start first, milk prices, 2017 and beyond.
Yeah, so I think right now when you look at where milk prices are for the U.S. as a whole, we should be, and I'll say right now, another $1.100 higher for an annual average in 2017 relative to 2016. And I say that probably cheating really hard because I lay right in the middle, not willing to get on the hot seat. As you all know, we go from record highs to record lows quite quickly. For the record high side, for those that might say, Scott, another dollar on milk prices isn't enough, I would say demand for China and larger cuts in places like Australia and New Zealand will be helpful to prices. On the negative side, that can make prices be lower than the dollar increase, I keep worrying about U.S. supply growth and whether or not that creates some problems for where U.S. prices go. And oh, by the way, when you look at what the European Union is doing, don't forget we still have fairly large intervention stocks of powder in the EU to deal with. I saw the announcement today that the EU is looking to try to move about 400,000 metric tons of powder over the next few months. That's not positive to markets, all right? So I like to remind us that there is downside risk, even though right now I would say on average we're going to talk about higher prices for 2017.
We have great questions from the audience. Like, I think I might take these into my own question asking abilities when I do interviews on a regular basis. Foreign markets are important, but what happens if people of other countries can't afford to buy our products at a price that is profitable for U.S. producers?
Yes, I think there's where we struggle. We can see so sometimes I like to talk for a minute about, so how many times did you hear an economist in the first 30 seconds of a talk say, you know what, we got to feed 9.x, and I'll say 9.7 billion people by 2050, and the idea is demand's just going to be there forever, right? So I like to, for a minute, say the growth from 1991 to 2016 in global population is roughly the same as it's going to be from today until 2050. We've been doing this for a long time. All right, so population growth is one thing, but much more important is, do those consumers in other countries have the income potential to buy our products? And I think you can look in some countries and worry whether or not income growth is enough to sustain purchasing power that they're going to need. In other countries, I'll say though, we're seeing some rapid increases in income levels. Income starting from lower income levels, where I think when you put another dollar in their pocket, they use a larger percentage of that dollar on food. So there are countries, China, India, generally Asia, I see a lot of countries with income growth that's strong. You get into the African countries, I think there's where we're going to struggle finding enough income to support purchases of U.S. dairy products.
But as that middle class rises, consumption of higher quality goods, proteins, cheeses, dairy products also goes up?
Absolutely, and I think when you look at dairy in particular, a lot of these countries do not consume anywhere near the kinds of dairy products that we do today, and what we think is of normal in terms of dairy product consumption. We're going to offer a lot of new choices for them over time that they haven't seen before, and that could only make demand stronger.
What will happen to dairy beef with Tyson discounting to processed dairy beef?
Yeah, all right, so very good question. I'll say when you look back at 2 years ago, we needed beef regardless of where it came from, right? We'd take dairy beef, we'd feed Holstein animals in feed yards that maybe we wouldn't have in the past. With the growth now in terms of beef cow inventory, the supply side situation is much different than it once was. It gives the Tysons of the world a chance to change what they're willing to pay for different types of beef. And maybe that's not the best message to provide to a bunch of dairy folks here in the room, but I remind us that providing beef that consumers want today is very important. If you look at what's been demand by grade of beef, we've seen strong growth in demand for prime or upper choice beef, and we've seen demand for select beef move lower. And so I think we have to continue to stay focused on that, and whatever we do on the dairy side to provide additional beef supplies, using beef genetics where possible. If we know we're going to move some of those animals into the beef market, maybe provides us some opportunities to get beyond that. But the help that the beef market has had for dairy producers the last couple of years is probably not going to be there as we look ahead for the next 4 or 5 with growing domestic beef supplies.
I have one last question, and then we're going to get the hook to wrap it up. NCBA, Tyson, Cargill, JBS, and National Beef, and the WTO convinced Congress to repeal country of origin labeling. How is this beneficial to American farmers and ranchers?
So I know there's going to be some very strong opinions on both sides of country of origin labeling, and I try to say I don't know what the right answer is to country of origin labeling. I think in some cases we can find consumers who are willing to pay a premium for what might be dubbed made in the USA. We have to look at what that premium might return to us relative to, there is cost with country of origin labeling, and so therein trying to balance those two gets very difficult. I don't think we're done battling country of origin labeling. However, I think the WTO has been very strong in its assessment of whether country of origin labeling works for us in the United States. But given that we may be moving towards what looks to be maybe a little less interest in new trade agreements, maybe we care a lot less about what the WTO thinks as we move ahead. But I don't think we're done with country of origin labeling.
Scott, thank you for your wonderful comments today. Audience, thank you for all of your great questions and your attention. We appreciate it. If you'd like to have our weekly livestock market update delivered to your email box every Saturday morning, you can go to brownfieldagnews.com, click on the subscribe link there, and actually you can also visit us back at our booth and we'll get you signed up to have it delivered. But you can also ask Scott questions weekly through there as well. I'm Meghan Grebner on Brownfield.